everything you need to know about products and services that can improve your life. This is Experts on Call on CL 650.
On this harvest moon.
And here we are in October, and we're just about to get our first series of storms. It's the week of the harvest moon, and I have Sean Lang and Dan Remdale in the studio with me, and we are talking about preparing your buildings for the fall, doing inspections, understanding what the limitations are around roofing, painting, exterior sealants, and products and materials. And we were talking just before we broke about rooftop planters, and let's just kind of finish that off a bit, because I think it's an important thing for buildings that have things like green roof systems, rooftop planters. People have planters on balconies and decks and those types of things. So let's tackle maybe just the rooftop planters first.
Well, okay, first of all, I prefer rooftop planters to any green roof system. So just to make that very clear, if you think that you're going to cover your entire roof with dirt and plants, you should think again, because there's a lot of maintenance that goes into that. There's irrigation, there's constant maintenance that goes with that. And then the effect of actually having to get to your roof system if there's a problem is tremendous. It adds a lot of cost to it. So please think that over before you're designing a building. Secondly, if you're going to go with planters, you want to make sure that you can move them. You don't want to build a planter because, oh, they said I can't have a green roof, so I'll put a planter, but I'm going to make it as big as a truck. Well, you don't want to do that. You want it to be movable by one person is preferable, two at the most. Keep it light so that you're not putting a lot of weight and stress on the roof systems that's below it. Again, as we talked about with the decks, there's a membrane that's below the planters or the decks that are actually, it performs a function. It's tremendous function. It's covering 100% of your building. Why are you putting this at risk? So for the sake of a little bit of aesthetic pleasing on your deck, keep it light. Keep the plants, I'm not a horticulturist, but make sure they don't have roots that are going to penetrate and leave the pot that they're in. And also keep in mind that there's birds that fly around and like to land on roofs, and they like to deposit material. When they deposit that material, it may be a foreign substance than what you planned on planting. So when you have a lot of growing medium up on your roof system, you're going to have to make sure you're maintaining it and weeding it and taking out any plants that you see pop up, because there'll be something growing there that you didn't plant there. And that may be a very intrusive plant that's going to develop roots that are going to come down. And I've actually seen them go into the seams of a roof system and cause a leak.
No, we certainly are seeing our experience now with members across the province that have green roof systems or extensive plant materials on roof planters, that as long as they are incredibly proactive and have very aggressive maintenance systems so that they can monitor the plant materials, they can monitor what's happening with respects to drainage. Planters, if the drainage of the planter plugs and they've not maintained it properly, if there isn't landscape material for a barrier to prevent debris from getting into the drains, all of these things, you end up with a rooftop planter that's the size of a freezer that ends up filling up with water. It can be a serious problem for a building. So
huge weight load.
So the maintenance, I think, is absolutely essential. But the other side of the maintenance, of course, is what happens when we end up with, on paint products and siding and materials, we end up with buildups of algae and mildew. And what does it do to the products? For starters, it obviously it causes erosion of some capacity. But Dan, what are the best ways of getting it off, and how frequently should we be maintaining that?
And maintenance on a painted surface is important. You talked earlier, Tony, about how you had these maples in a corner against a building, and a lot of the engineers now are saying if you can allow between 18 and 24 inches between any planted material and the wall surface in order to get some air movement in there, that'll make a dramatic difference. If a place is getting wet and staying wet, then it's going to develop algae just like it would in your bathroom or shower kind of area. So you want to make sure it's got air movement so it can dry. And if there's a lot of plants, and you'll see, I walked up to a balcony system on a south side of a building recently, townhome building, and there were about 9 balconies across this side, and one of them, most of the wood on that balcony just below the deck surface was completely rotten. All the rest of them looked fine, all facing the same elevation. Well, the deck just above it had about 12 potted plants on it. And you could tell that the person probably loved their plants, watered them regularly, the water rolled down off the plants, the pollen from the plants and so on, kept the whole area wet, and now mildew began to build up on there, and that developed wood rot on the trim, and that was going to need to be replaced when we did any painting work there. So you want to make sure first off that the area is able to stay dry. You want to give some direction to those people that have potted plants on their balconies about how to water, but not have everything stay completely soaked and running down on your neighbor's balcony probably isn't appreciated by them, but it also isn't appreciated by the wall surfaces and the trim surfaces.
Another point that I recently discovered through a small error we made at our home is that you got to watch the fertilizers that you use too. We fertilized, or my wife fertilized some plants on our driveway, which is an aggregate driveway, and the runoff from the fertilizer as it's washed through the plant actually caused an effect on the driveway that I can't get rid of. So I don't know what kind of damage that would do to paints, but it's certainly something you'd want to watch for a roof system. So you want to be very careful with that too.
Well, the other issue, and we have had a building in the province that had to deal with this, is the roofing system has drains, which are internal drains in the building, and they had an extensive number of plantings on the rooftop that the fertilizers and the chemicals they were using on the rooftop, they discovered, eventually had an adverse effect on the sealants and epoxies that were used on the joints of the drains. So, you know, it wasn't anticipated, you know, the cause and effect weren't anticipated, but you're absolutely right. You have to think about what you're doing and what the eventual effect is going to be on that. So what's the best way to remove mildew, you know?
And I would say this wintertime is a great time to go out and review the exterior building and do some of that wet washing. When a surface is already wet and damp from the rain and so on, it's not going to interfere that much to do some more washing. Mildew needs to be killed, and the only way that we've been able to figure out to kill it in the West Coast is to use a bleach solution. And so typically what you do is you take a bleach and water solution, about 5:1, so 1 part bleach to about 5 parts of water. Mix that together, put it on the surface and let it dwell. Let it sit there for 5 minutes to 15 minutes, depending on how aggressive you need it. And then you need to scrub it. You actually need to take a scrub brush and physically move that algae off. And if it's been really bad, you might need to do that again until it's completely clean. Then give it a nice rinse. Some people will say, well, I don't like dealing with bleach. I'm worried about bleach, and I understand that I'm not a personal fan favorite of bleach either. If you have some nice plants, maybe put some plastic or protect them or that kind of thing. But bleach will at least kill those spores, and so they won't continue to do what they're doing. And what they're doing, actually, they're beginning to grow into the paint and eat the paint, and eventually into any organic matter. So that's why they like wood so much. They actually feed on the wood. Right. And so especially at the corners and so on, you'll see them begin to feed on that, and that's the beginning of wood rot, and that's going to cause maintenance issues.
Which is all fine unless you're dealing with mildew on the 18th floor of your high-rise, and then that's a whole other story about how that building is being maintained and washed and painted. And,
that's right.
How long? You know, look at a typical wood frame building. I use the word typical. They are all so different, every building that you look at. But take a building with hardy plank, for example. You know, what's the life expectancy of that coating before you need to be replacing it and upgrading it?
So the manufacturers of paint coatings will say that 7 to 8 years is a typical lifespan of a good coating that's on there. We talked earlier about new construction, and the coatings that are often put on there may not be to the thickness that they should be for a manufacturer to get that long out of the coating. So paints might only last 5 or 6 years in your first repaint. But after they've been painted well, 7 or 8 years is reasonable. And what we often say is, depending on the elevation or the area that you're in, if you can plan to wash it in between those cycles. So if you're going to cycle your paint at 7 or 8 years, and maybe at your 3rd or 4th year, you're going to come in and do some targeted bleach and then do a wash of the area, get the dirt off the surface that's holding the mildew, and clean the entire building. That's a very good option for most buildings.
So one of the problems we have in the industry, and this is definitely a problem, exactly what you're saying, both interior and exterior, the minimal amount of product is frequently put on the building so when it's sold. So whether it's roofing, paints, balconies, decks, you know, sealants, epoxies. But we also have, especially with wood frame buildings, we have buildings that shrink and they settle, and there are transitions in these buildings, especially in the first 10 years. But we have a growing problem that strata corporations aren't really looking at their first paint job till they're 12 to 15 years old. So that has to be having, you know, damaging effects to the wood surfaces, which shortens the life, which over the long term is eventually just going to cost the strata more money.
Yeah, and if the wood surfaces maybe aren't as good as they used to be, maybe the boards, the siding
the
grade of the wood isn't as good as it used to be, and now it's weathering even longer than it should, so the paint protection is gone from it after 7 or 8 years. Now you're extending that another 3 or 4 years. Yeah, you might be in a situation where you're having to completely sand an area or fully prime an area, or even replace some siding or some wood in particular elevations. Those are all additional costs that you're going to encounter that you wouldn't have had to have if you had gotten to that maintenance earlier. And a very simple check, a very simple review of your building, probably take about an hour to do a walk around, or we'd be happy to come out and give you a maintenance review at no charge. Why we do that is it'll give you a quick snapshot of where you're at in that cycle and when you should be considering it, and maybe even a budget for that as well.
It's a good plan. So here's a question that I hear a lot when we're dealing with paint materials and products at meetings, and I find it quite interesting, and I think it's a great question because it deals with some of the terminology we use in the industry. But oftentimes we'll find people are advocating that, well, let's just power wash and paint the building, but why do we need primers? Why do we use primers? So what's the purpose of a primer on a product?
A primer typically has, there's a couple of kinds of primers, but most primers, when we're talking about wood or that kind of surface, are intended to do two things. First off, they're intended to seal the surface. So if you can get a watertight seal on that wood and prevent moisture from getting back into the end grains of the wood. Wood's kind of like a whole series of straws, and so it's really porous. It loves moisture. That's how it's grown, right? So you need to seal that with a primer. The second point of a primer, and some of them, all they do is adhesion, right? So to make it stick. So paint needs to stick to the surface, and especially if you've got maybe an older surface that has an oil-based coating on it, or a very like a metal surface that's shiny or hard to get paint to stick to, you need to rough it up, but then you put a primer on, and the primer's purpose is to adhere, just to stick to that and provide a transition, a bridge between the surface you have, that metal or that oil-based coating, and whatever new coating you're going to put on, so it doesn't peel off after 6 months or a year.
Kind of the Velcro of paint, then.
What about those paint and primers in one? Are those any good?
So years ago, you would buy a stereo, and you get that all-in-one stereo, right? And they worked okay, right, for the place you wanted that all-in-one stereo. But if you're really someone who loved music, you bought all the components. And why? Because it really was that much better. And I would say the same is true about the all-in-one primer and paints. Has technology shifted, and are they very good? Yes. Do we as a professional association use them? No, we don't. We still use primers to do priming work because it can do a targeted job, just like a sealant could do a targeted job of just doing that. And then your finish coats can do the protective job.
Yeah, we see similar products in the roofing trade too, like the guy you see on TV who sprays the screen door and then puts it in a boat,
right?
Floats down. Like, come on, really? Yeah. There's a whole industry that's developed roofing products to properly protect the building, but you can buy it in a spray can and get away with it? I don't think so.
Yeah, if it should be on everyone's license that the caption, if it's too good to be true, it really is too good to be true. Yeah. That applies to everything, and we see that all the time. But people are lured into this misconception that we have a quick, easy fix for you that will solve all the problems. It just defers the problems into other issues is what ends up happening. I'm Tony Giventu, the host of Key Pacific's Talk About Strata. If you'd like to send us an email, we have an email address, questions@talkaboutstrata.com. This is 650 Sea Isle. You're listening to Experts on Call.
This is Experts on Call on Sea Isle 650.